On behalf of the U.S. Embassy in Mexico and the U.S. Mexico Commission for Education and Cultural Exchange, I am pleased to welcome you to the opening of this lecture series with outstanding Mexican scholars. We are so proud that most of them are Fulbright alumni, with whom we have worked extensively to promote closer understanding between citizens of the United States and Mexico, as well as strengthen our bilateral relationship. The U.S. Mexico Bilateral Relationship is unique and possibly one of the most important worldwide, not only because of our extended border, but because of the many factors that bring us together. For example, our shared history. I don't need to give you more data because that is exactly why you're here, to hear from one of Mexico's top bilateral relationship specialists. I encourage you all to consider supplementing or furthering your studies in Mexico or in another country, as studying abroad offers many benefits, such as enhancing knowledge and appreciation of other cultures and languages, making connections with new people, broadening your experiences beyond tourism, all of which enrich your lives personally and enhance your employability. We hope to welcome you here one day here in Mexico. However, without further ado, I'd like now to introduce you to Dr. Rafael Ferna de Castro and extend our sincerest gratitude for launching this series. Dr. Fernández de Castro is the director of the U.S. Mexican Studies Center at the University of California, San Diego. Prior to accepting this position, he was the Dean of International Studies at one of Mexico's top private higher educational institutions, the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico, better known as ITAM, and a presidential foreign policy advisor, just to mention a few of his many accomplishments. I reiterate our appreciation for you being here with us today, and I thank you all for your attendance, for your interest, your participation.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm sorry for being a little late. Sometimes there's even traffic in San Diego, so I'm sorry for being a few minutes late. I'm very happy to talk to you about the importance of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And I will speak for about 15, 20 minutes maximum, because I would prefer you to ask me questions and to engage in a dialogue with you. I mean, what is the big thing happening now in the world? Of course, is the Russia invasion to Ukraine. I mean, there's a lot of impacts there, and of course, there's people dying. There's young kids dying, and they basically, lots of them, they will not, I mean, they're going to have a very difficult future because a lot of the cities will be destroyed. But so far, for example, there's been close to 5 million Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine, about 5 million internally and about 5 million overseas. And that, for example, has a direct impact. Just 25 miles from where I live in San Diego. I live close to UCSD, which is the North County in San Diego. Just 25 miles away from here is Tijuana, and actually about between 200 and 300 Ukrainians are landing every day in the Tijuana airport, and they coming to seek asylum in the U.S. And of course, President Biden has said that the U.S. will accept up to 100,000 Ukrainians. And I would say most of Ukrainians are coming first to Mexico and then trying to come into the U.S. Always when there's a problem in the world, you'll see there's migrants and there's people coming to the U.S.-Mexico border. I would say the U.S.-Mexico border is connected to the well-being of the rest of the hemisphere and to the world. For example, nowadays, there's some Colombians worried about there's going to be elections very soon in Colombia, and some of them are fearing one of the candidates. Well, in the last few weeks, there's been a huge number of Colombians coming into Tijuana, and they're trying to come into the U.S. For example, Haitians, when Haiti had a bad earthquake 12 years ago, there were a lot of Haitians coming here, but also some of those Haitians, they decided to go to Chile and to Brazil. And just in the last few months, they decided, those Haitians who have lived for many years in Chile and in Brazil, they decided to try to come across the entire continent and come into the US through Mexico. So then our border is connected to the well-being of the world. So that is just to give you a sense of the importance of the border and how U.S.-Mexico, or the U.S.-Mexico border is connected to the entire world. I will say, I mean, if I would like to make a summary of the importance of U.S.-Mexican relationship, I would say there's three main areas, three main issues that I would say stand out as the most important topics in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. A very important one is immigration. I just been talking about immigration, and another very important one, it's, I would say, security and drugs, very, very important for the US and Mexico. And third, it's, I would say, trade and investment. So those are, I would say, the three pillars of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And let me give you a sense of what's happening in each one of those three areas. Just basic information about immigration. Well, there's almost 12 million Mexicans living in the U.S. So about 9% of the Mexican population lives in the U.S. And out of those 12 million people, about half of them, they don't have documents. They are irregular migrants in the U.S. And so, yes, there's a lot. But if you think about Mexicans in the U.S., I mean, if you want to think about, for example, the Mexican diaspora, what we call it the diaspora, well, there's not only the Mexicans who live here, but there's 38 million people in the U.S. of Mexican origin. Out of those 38 million, 12 million are from Mexico. Those Mexicans who migrated here. And then there's 26 million of Americans of Mexican origin, what we call Mexican Americans. So there's about 60 million Latinos, and about 2/3 of those Latinos are from Mexican origin. So that will give you a sense of the importance of migration, of the importance of Latinos in the US. So it is enormous. And I would say in the last 15 years, since 2007, there's less Mexicans coming to the US. For many years in the 1980s, in the 1990s, in the first 7 years of the 2000s, lots of Mexicans were trying to come into the US as migrants. But in 2007, 2008, there's less Mexicans trying to come into the US, and there's been more Mexicans coming back to Mexico from the US, the return migrants. It's enormous. In the last 15 years, there's been more than 4 million Mexicans who have been deported back to Mexico. And you can understand that that's something that is very strong for Mexicans, because some of those kids stay in Mexico. Just to give you a sense, for example, there's about 500,000 kids in Mexico. They are Americans, and some of them, most of them, they do not speak Spanish. So because of that very important return migration flows, now there's a lot of kids in Mexico that they do not speak Spanish, and they only speak English. And of course, there's problems for them to get into schools or to do well in schools. So, I mean, this is just to give you a sense of how important is the migration phenomenon. And of course, so we have those Mexicans who still are trying to come here. We have all of those Mexicans coming back, some of them on a voluntary basis, and some of them, they've been deported, so they're not coming back to Mexico voluntarily speaking. And also we have a very important third flow of migrants, which are those transiting through Mexico to come to the United States. In the last few years, we've been having literally hundreds of thousands of Central Americans coming all the way through Mexico to try to come into the US. And we have also, I would say, yes, just, I would say in the last 6 months, I would say easily 50,000 patients have been trying to come, have been coming to the US-Mexico border. I would say about perhaps 25,000, they have entered already into the US. Some of those have been deported back to Haiti. So it's complicated, but that will give you a sense of how complicated and how complex is the migration phenomenon. And yes, now the big things are the Ukrainians, because yes, I mean, they arrive into Tijuana, and in less than 24 hours, they are able to come across the U.S. So that's, I would say that's, I would say Ukrainians, they have fast track. The U.S. is willing to accept them, and of course, I mean, they only stay in Mexico less than 24 hours. They arrive into the airport, then they take into a shelter. In the shelter, they get the data, and in the next few hours, they will come across the U.S. with no problem. But in Tijuana, there's about 40, perhaps 50,000 migrants waiting to come into the U.S. Lots of them asking for asylum. And of course, they have to wait there 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 18 months. So some of them are staying in Tijuana for very, very long time. That is to give you a sense of how complex is the migration phenomenon. And let me share something with you. On immigration issues, I would say there's very low cooperation between Mexico and the US. It's hard to understand, but I would say the US has been trying for the last 18 years, since 2004, when President George W. Bush was trying to get reelected, he basically said the US immigration system is broken. Let's have immigration reform. And he tried to do immigration reform, and so far we haven't had immigration reform in the US. And so yes, the system has to be improved, and that has created some problems between Mexico and the US. But my take on this is that there's very little or very low cooperation between Mexico and the US in migration-related issues. That, for example, is very different from what is happening in trade and investment. In trade and investment, we negotiated in the early 1990s, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And NAFTA basically ordered trade flows between Mexico and the US and Canada, and ordered investment between US, Mexico, the US, Mexico, and Canada. And I would say that the agreement, NAFTA itself, was a wonderful piece to order trade between the 3 North American countries. Because of that, now Mexico is Mexico, not Canada, not China. Nowadays, Mexico is the single most important trade partner of the US. About 16% of US exports are sent to Mexico. That's a lot. About 6 million jobs in the US depend directly of these exports to Mexico. So that's so you can understand that Mexico as a trade partner is extremely important for the US, and the other way around. Of course, Mexico exports to the US between 70 and 80% of our total exports. So the US is key for the well-being of Mexico, of Mexicans. And I have never lived in a border town. Now I live in San Diego. I grew up in Mexico City, and I went to school in Washington, D.C. So being in Mexico City and being in Washington, D.C., I mean, you get that the relationship between Mexico and the US is very important, but once you live in a border town like San Diego, like Tijuana, you really get it that this is very, very important. For example, here in San Isidro, about every day there's about 80,000 crossings, and so it's huge. In San Isidro, we have about, I mean, if we think in car lines, there's about 15 car lines, and it's very busy all the time. So that really represents San Isidro. I mean, it's how well connected is Tijuana and San Diego, how well connected is Baja California and California. San Isidro is the most busiest entry port in the entire Western Hemisphere. So that is very telling of the importance of US-Mexican relationship. But I was telling you that, well, NAFTA was renegotiated in 2019, 2020, President Trump decided to improve the agreement, and there was a negotiation, and now we have a new agreement. So we don't have NAFTA anymore. Now we have what we call the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, the USMCA, and that orders the relationship between Mexico, the U.S. and Canada. It's not a perfect agreement, but I would say it's a very important legal framework for Mexicans, Canadians, and Americans to order our trade flows and to make sure that the Mexican door is going to, it will continue to be open for U.S. exports and the other way around for Mexico and for Canada. So thanks to NAFTA and now the USMCA, I would say we have a free trade zone in North America that has been very, very important, for example, to make North America competitive in for example, in autos. Yes, the auto industry is central to NAFTA, and because we have these rulings created by NAFTA, now followed by the USMCA, I would say cooperation in trade and investment issues is very sophisticated in Mexico and the US. And now let me give you a sense about what's happening in the security area. I would say, Mexico and the US have been trying hard to cooperate on this area. I mean, what affects the US? Well, there's quite a few drugs coming in from Mexico to the US. Yes, this cocaine is coming all the way from Colombia, gets into Central America. From Central America, sometimes this is shipped to Mexico, sometimes it comes across directly through the ocean, to the Pacific Ocean, to the US. But most of that drug will come into Mexican territory and then is shipped back into the US. Why is this so important for the US? Well, let's face it, last year, the US had a very bad crisis of the opioids. So close to 100,000 Americans died of an overdoses. Well, all of this has to do with the opioids, with Americans having, abusing opioids. And what really concerns the US about Mexico is that, for example, lately there's a lot of fentanyl, this synthetic heroin, coming from China into Mexico and then transshipped from Mexico to the US. And now this fentanyl, for example, it's sometimes is 50 times more strong than the heroin. So that is causing a lot of deaths in the US. What is Mexico's #1 problem in terms of security, in terms of with the US? Well, I would say it's violence. Mexican cartels have become very violent. There's a huge availability of guns in Mexico, and that's something that we have to increase and improve cooperation between Mexico and the US. There's a lot of guns coming into Mexico throughout the US-Mexico border. I will say when you come in, if I'm going now to Tijuana, I mean, it's very easy for me to come across. It's always harder to come back from Tijuana to San Diego, but I would say that Mexico will have to do a better job in trying to make sure that there's not so much smuggle of arms into Mexico, because that gives a lot of firepower to the Mexican cartels. So I would say Mexico needs more security. We need to decrease the level of homicides in Mexico. We have to decrease the power capacity of cartels. And on the other hand, we'll have to cooperate with the US, because let's face it, the US is having an enormous problem with opioids, and that's something that should concern Mexico. And I would say now we have a new agreement. We used to have what was called the Merida Initiative. That was basically the mechanism through which Mexico and the US were trying to put its act together and be more efficient in getting better security for Mexicans and for Americans. And now we have the bicentennial agreement, and so that is the new agreement between President López Obrador and President Biden to try to be more effective in stopping drugs for coming into the US territory and for stopping arms coming from the US into Mexico, and to just make sure that we're more effective in combating cartels and more effective in making sure that there's less demand for drugs in the US. So I already gave you a sense of the main topics of U.S.-Mexican relations, and so why don't I stop here? And I would prefer to have a dialogue with you. I'll be happy to entertain questions. So you tell me how should I do this? I wonder if you could open your microphones, or you could send those questions through the Q&A. But I'll be very happy to ask you questions and to try to enter into a dialogue with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rafael Fernández de Castro. Very nice seeing you. And thank you for delivering this first very interesting and informative thoughts. I will be reading out the questions that come up in the question and answer panel. I invite our attendees to include your questions there. And so I can read them to Dr. Fernández de Castro. So the first one comes from Juan Sandoval. And his question is, what is your perspective on Citibank leaving the Mexican consumer banking market?
Well, it's a partial Citibank. I mean, not all the operations will leave Mexico, and but I would say it's a major decision taken in the US. I believe that it really has to do with restructuring the bank more than an operation in Mexico. But I believe that some part of the operations will stay in Mexico, and of course, I mean the banks that we know, like the different branches. Well, it's, I mean, everybody's thinking who's going to buy Banamex, because most probably the bank who will buy Banamex might become the single most important bank in Mexico. So there's a lot of interest at stake. And but I believe it was an internal decision by Citi, and they saw that they have to consolidate their business in the US and in some other parts of the world. And for reasons that I don't know, they decided to go about this. And I know that they will keep lots of their operations in Latin America, because they decided to withdraw from Mexico.
Thank you, Dr. Fernández de Castro. Our next question comes from Paula de Gortari. And her question is, what is your perspective about the role that universities need to play?
That's a very important question, Paula. Well, I mean, there's many ways to address that question. I will say that the US continues to have the single most important and strong university system in the world. About 30 out of these 50 best ranked universities in the world, they are located in the US. So one of the ways to see this, Paulo, is that I would say Mexico is not taking full advantage of having this wonderful university system next. It's why are not that many Mexicans coming? There's only about, according to Open Doors, there's only about 15,000 Mexicans in regular programs in US universities. That is doing a BA or a master's program, I mean, or a PhD. So I believe that, I mean, people like Hazel Blackmore, I mean, through Comexus, she's been a champion of trying to facilitate and to promote more Mexicans to come into the US. And sometimes Mexican universities, they want to have all of these PhD programs, which is fine. But I believe if you have next door the best university system, my take on this would be I will try to take advantage of it. And we're not taking full advantage of this. Why is this happening? Well, many reasons. I guess one of those is that there's very few Mexicans, unfortunately. The percentage of Mexicans who are fluent in English is not very high. And Unfortunately, English has not been a priority in the elementary education in Mexico and in the secondary education. It's changing, by the way. I will say the Education Ministry of Mexico now has English as a top priority, but that is only recently. So that's a problem. I would say there's not enough resources in Mexico, financial resources for Mexicans to come here. Let's face it, U.S. universities have become, even public universities, extremely expensive. So it's not that easy for a Mexican to afford the U.S. university. And but I would say it's also because I would say it's, I mean, if you compare Mexicans to South Koreans, I would say South Koreans, they truly believe that if they're able to come and to study in a U.S. university, that will really facilitate matters for them, and they will be able to have these very, very exciting professional careers. So there's South Korea is the #4 country in sending students to the U.S. And they don't have much scholarships. They will try very hard. They get very well prepared in high schools in South Korea to come to the U.S. They're very competitive. But I believe there is this culture in South Korea that if you go to the U.S., if you get your degree for one of the top U.S. universities, then you will make it in the professional world in South Korea or wherever you are. So that's, I mean, that's something that I believe we're missing in Mexico, Paula, and I do believe now, living in the border, that there's a lot of exchanges, and there's universities like Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, or like CETIS Universidad, which has 3 campuses, that they're very active in seeking opportunities for their students in the U.S. So I believe that, I mean, it's we need more Mexicans to come to the U.S. and we need more Americans to come to the U.S. I mean, if we forge these relations at the college level, I believe that we Mexicans and we Americans, we will understand each other much, much better. I believe that there's a special room out there for Latinos, for Mexican Americans to be able to have an opportunity to come to Mexican universities to do a semester. So I believe that Mexican universities should be more aggressive in trying to recruit Mexican Americans and in general Americans. It's not easy. Sometimes, for example, Guanajuato, which is a beautiful state of Mexico, lately, I must say, it has become fairly violent. So now, I mean, we were discussing, I mean, to be honest, not long ago, a program between UCSD and Guanajuato. And I had to say that, well, we have to be careful because unfortunately, Guanajuato has become a very violent place lately. So, I mean, violence is affecting Mexico, and as violence was affecting Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. But now the problem is in Mexico, and I believe that, yes, because of violence, because of corruption, sometimes there's not this interest in U.S. students to come to Mexico. It's very telling that I believe more Americans are coming to tiny Costa Rica than to Mexico to study. So we must do something, Paula, and because I would say the potential is enormous. The U.S. has 330 million inhabitants. Mexico is also a very large, very populated country with 130 million inhabitants, with the second largest Latin American country. And I believe that, I mean, the potential between Mexico and the U.S. is just enormous. And we need more Hazels, Blackmores. We need more Conexus, because it's, let's face it, there's not that many sources lately for Mexicans to be able to get scholarships to come to the U.S.
Thank you, Rafael. And there's a follow-up question about education from Patricia Gándara, and she's asking, isn't it a big reason for failure of Mexicans to take advantage of the university system, the lack of adequate preparation in much of the Mexican educational system?
Well, Patricia Gándara is the I mean, she's perhaps the professor in California who knows better the academic exchanges between Mexico and the US and the potential, especially in the elementary school and the secondary school of better educated Mexicans and Americans. You're right, Patricia. Perhaps the single most important obstacle for Mexicans to come into the US is that most of the Mexican educational system is not competitive enough. In sharp contrast to South Korea, which has a very, very competitive educational system, and South Koreans, they give education an enormous priority in their lives. In Mexico, we don't have this very competitive system. Still, I believe I mean, you all know that we've been trying to do education reform for the last 25 years. Well, for the last 15 years in Mexico, is not yet there. But I'll tell you, coming from ITAM, I mean, I can tell you that Mexico could be very competitive. ITAM is extremely competitive, and Hazel knows that. And ITAM is a tiny university, 5,000 students. And I don't know how's the data right now, but so far, I believe 3-4 years ago, I mean, just after the National University, which is enormous, ITAM students were the ones getting more scholarships than any other Mexican university. So that is an example that when there's quality in an education, when there's academic excellence, when there's when a university decides to become very competitive, then we Mexicans could be very successful in the US. So I would say ITAM is a wonderful example that is very telling about the potential of Mexico to come to the best universities in the world and in the US.
Thank you, Rafael. We have a question from another friend, Silvia Núñez-García, who reads you and sends you congratulations. And she is asking, what are the most pressing domestic issues for the USA? And what can both countries do together to have an empathy-driven agenda?
Wow, that's I'll tell you, Silvia, I'm very worried about what's going on now in the US and what is going on in Mexico. I haven't seen, for example, I mean, let's face it, President López Obrador is politicizing US-Mexican relations. The NAFTA rule was you cannot politicize US-Mexican relations. You cannot politicize the way you deal with the US because the US is so important for Mexico that you got to be very careful. And unfortunately, Andrés Manuel López Obrador is not following that rule. And so I'm concerned because I mean, I would say that the US democracy has become fairly weak. I mean, there's, let's face it, there's two political parties in the US, and the Republican Party, that now 60% of Republicans are saying that they believe that the 2020 election was not a legitimate election, was a fraudulent election. Well, that is very telling of the fragility of the democracy in the US. And so I would say that US domestic issues and the huge polarization in the US, it's affecting US democracy and it's affecting the entire world because it is the US who decided that they don't want to lead the world, and because of Trump and because of the war in Iraq and because of the war in Afghanistan, now I would say there's an end to what I would call the Pax Americana, that wonderful period after World War II, in which the US was the leader of the world and in which there was peace in Europe. Now there's no peace in Europe. There's the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and really a lot has to do with internal domestic problems in the US. So I believe that Yes, there's a lot of domestic issues that are affecting U.S.-Mexican relations. The single most important one I would say is polarization. It's the inability of the U.S. To pass immigration reform. It's how these I would say very conservative Republicans, very racist positions of Republicans are now mainstream in the U.S. So it's very worrisome. I never thought that I would be saying that I would be seeing this intolerance that I'm seeing now in the U.S. and it's very worrisome. The same is happening in Mexico. I believe Mexico has become enormously polarized. You have those who love AMLO and those who hate AMLO, and there's very little dialogue between these two camps. And so I'm worried about the state of democracies in both countries, and I'm very worried about the impact of this in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I believe we should be conscious of that. It's worrisome what we've seen. Sometimes I don't get how come Andrés Manuel López Obrador could be. I mean, he understands. I mean, he's a Mexican leader who understands U.S.-Mexican relations, who has read lots of history books, and he knows that it's in the benefit of Mexico to have to cooperate as much as possible with the U.S. So sometimes I don't get why he politicizes this relationship, and sometimes when he is a bit too. I mean, for example, it's very hard for me to understand why Mexico is somewhat benevolent with the Russia of Vladimir Putin. I cannot understand that. Mexico voted in the UN against the Russian invasion, but I would say in its language, in its positions, I would say President López Obrador has been, I would say, fairly nice to Russia, and I don't understand what that is coming from, because it's hard to understand, to put it mildly.
Thank you, Rafael. There is a question about violence. It says, it's an anonymous attendee, and it says, how do violence and organized crime in Mexico affect migration policy in the U.S. and the Mexico-U.S. trade?
That's a very good question. Violence is so pervasive in Mexico that now it's affecting everything. We're talking about Mexico has become the 4th or 5th most violent country in Latin America. Latin America is the most violent region on earth. About Latin America, I mean, we Latin Americans represent about 8% of the world's population, and Latin America concentrates about 32-33% of world's homicide. And Mexico has become very, very violent. Nowadays, I mean, about 24, there's 24 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants in Mexico. That's way too much. After 10, it is considered as a structural violence. So Mexico is high above that. So yes, that violence is affecting everything. It's affecting Americans who want to come to Mexico. It's affecting businesses. Tijuana, for example, which is just next door, Tijuana in the last 5 years has been in the top 10 most violent cities in the world, and because of that, I mean, even with that violence, Tijuana is doing very well economically speaking. But imagine if Tijuana were a safe place. I believe that even me and Patricia, my wife, we will be living in Tijuana, because it will cost me 3 times less to live in Tijuana than to live in San Diego. But I don't live there because and sometimes I don't go there at night because there's violence. So yes, I mean, and how migration is affected. Well, let me tell you something. In many ways, there's a very large number of Michoacanos in Tijuana asking for asylum in the U.S. But I'm talking about dozens, thousands of Michoacanos staying there. And there's also tens of thousands of people from Guerrero in the Mexican border towns asking for asylum in the US. Because let's say it, Guerrero, Tamaulipas, and Michoacan are as deadly as the worst place in Honduras or in El Salvador or in Guatemala. So yes, it is affecting migration flows. Now there's a lot of migrants coming into the US, not fleeing economic hardships, but fleeing from violence. I have talked to a lot of migrants. I have talked to a lot of señoras in Michoacán, ladies from Michoacán, that they come and they basically, the story I remember, the last one that I had a conversation with her, say, well, I'm here with my two daughters because my husband disappeared and a cartel disappeared him. I don't know whether he died or, but they called me and they were threatening my daughters and I decided to come here. I have heard that story a lot. So yes, it is affecting migration. And it is also affecting those Central Americans or those Haitians and those Ukrainians who are stationed in Tijuana waiting to come across the US because Tijuana is a very unsafe place, as well it is Ciudad Juárez and as well it is Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas. So it's, yes, violence is affecting migration flows in lots of ways. And I will say that lately it's not only migration issues, but it's migration and violence, which is basically explaining lots of migration and lots of people seeking asylum status in the US. There's lots of familias in Michoacán, lots of them in Tijuana. And it's very sad to see them that they could stay there months, and then you see the Ukrainians, and they will come across in less than 24 hours. It's okay. I take it. I'm glad that Ukrainians are able to come into the US, but what's happening with the rest? It's to say the least, it's unfair. Very good question, but a very long answer because yes, violence is pervasive in Mexico, it's pervasive in Latin America, and it's very deadly in Tijuana. And I talked to my friends. I was just having now lunch with some business persons from Tijuana. I introduced to them the new president of the Colegio de la Frontera Norte, and we were talking about, how can we create a better narrative of Tijuana? But to have a better narrative of Tijuana, we have to solve a central issue, which is Tijuana should be less dangerous, less deadly. Let's say it.
Thank you, Rafa. Sonia Lopez is asking, what is the role or impact that border states have in the Mexico-US relationship?
Wow, that's a very good question, Sonia. And, it's very telling, but I would say the 6 Mexican border states and the 4 US border states have very little to say. Migration policies decided in Washington, not even in Mexico City. When President Trump last March 20th, 2020, the year that the pandemic came, Washington decided to shut the US-Mexico border without consulting no one. And of course, they did not consult San Diego, Tijuana. So I would say we don't have much to say. And especially the border continues to be very, very centralized in Washington. Everything that has to do with security-related issues, border-related issues is very centralized in Washington. A little bit in Mexico City, but it's really Washington calling the shots. And not only that, for example, we used to have these border conference, these border governors conferences every year, which were very helpful. The 10 governors will get together and they have different commissions. We haven't had that conversations in the last 10 years. 20 years ago, we have these liaison mechanisms in the border cities, not anymore. So there's very little conversation between Tijuana and San Diego in an orderly way. And now, for example, I'm helping the governor of Baja California and the governor of California and Baja California Sur, and we're trying to put together again the Commission of the Californias, which is very important because it's California in itself is a very special land in the world, so this commission was created in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California, and we haven't had that commission in the last 12 years or so. So I'm trying to help the state governors to put this together. I do believe in mechanisms of consultation. I wrote on that topic my doctoral dissertation. So everybody believes it's a very boring topic, but I believe that is key, is paramount to order international relations. And that's why now living in San Diego, I'm convinced. Today I have 2 calls with that. I had a call with the Mexican consul in San Diego and the Mexican consul in Sacramento, Liliana Ferrer, and to talk about, ideas of, what could be the key topics of this Commission of the Californias. And I also had another conversation with Tom Riot, the U.S. consul in Tijuana, because he serves not only Baja California, but also Baja California Sur. So he's knowledgeable about the needs of Baja California Sur. And so this is a very important question, Sonia. I would say it's, in terms of policy making, these 10 states, they don't have much to say on immigration and border related issues. But then now let me go in the optimistic way. This May 1st, we're going to have a wonderful thing happening in California. There's going to be medical for every single person in California 50 years and older. That means that regardless of your migration status, you're going to be able to access every single health system in California if you're 50 or older. That's available for young people from 0 to 26, and that's available from 50 and older. This is wonderful. This is going to be the case starting May 1st. This is a wonderful, I would say, thing happening in Sacramento. There's a new law, and I believe that's very good news. And it's very telling of the importance of the states. And I would say it's very telling about that California has decided in the last 10 years or so to be pro-migrant. And there's people like Javier Becerra, who now it's Secretary of Health of Mr. Biden, where he used to be the Attorney General of California, and he suited more than 100 times the Trump administration. You know what Javier told me once, Sonia? Javier Becerra was for about more than 20 years member of Congress, and then he quitted that position and he became the Attorney General of California. He told me, Rafael, when I was a kid, I suffered discrimination. I'll make sure that my grandchildren, they will not go through those discrimination issues that I had. That's what this is personal for me. And again, he suited, or the state of California suited more than 100 times the Trump administration, mostly for environmental related issues, but many of them were on migration grounds. So this is, and it's very telling. For example, I'm just editing, I just finished editing the book comparing the relationship of Texas and Mexico and California and Mexico, because it happens that the 2 states that really concentrate relations with Mexico is Texas and the U.S. Actually, for Texas, Mexico is much more important than for California because California is more diversified. On top of that, you know what Governor Abbott just did? He basically stopped the U.S. Mexico border, and he's very anti-Mexican, and he could do things like that. I believe because, well, he's a Republican, because he's seeking re-election, and because there's no Latino power in Texas and there's Latino power in California. Latino legislators are very important in California. They have been very important in the last 30 to 40 years, and yet Latinos, they still are struggling in Texas to get into powerful positions, and well, that's the difference. Texas aligns with Republicans, and they are very anti-immigration, even racist positions. And California is very Democrat. I mean, everybody's a Democrat in California, every single elected official in Sacramento, and they are very pro-immigration. Not always was like that. In the 1990s, California was more anti-immigration than Texas, but now it's the other way around. This is fascinating, Sonia. So it's I mean, I could be talking for hours about the importance of the states, but I believe that the states gotta put their act in order, and I believe that I mean, California is a very powerful state. California in itself is the 5th or the 6th most important economy of the world, and still I would say there's much more than California could do with Mexico and with its neighbors, Baja California and Baja California Sur.
Thank you, Rafa. We're actually on time, but if you don't mind, I will read 4 questions that are on the chat, and maybe you can pick and choose little things to answer those questions and have your closing statements, so we don't go too much over time. So, okay, the first question comes from Jack Corvey. His question is, it appears President Lopez Obrador has reduced funding for Mexican graduate students seeking to study in the United States. It is actually true, and how will it affect long-term Mexico-US educational relations? We have a second question from Andrea Torres. Her question is, what are the challenges in the US Mexico relationship that became evident or worsened during the pandemic? Then the third question is from Maria Fernanda Cruz Islas, and she is asking, hi, thank you for sharing all of this with us. I have a question. What is your perspective on the binational relationship regarding the gender violence crisis? And finally, we have another question that says, what is your perspective on the digital nomad phenomenon and the US professionals who have relocated to Mexico to remote work during the pandemic?
Thank you. All beautiful questions. I will try to answer them all. Jack, yes, AMLO has, I mean, he has not only diminished the budget for CONACYT and for scholarship, but basically he has diminished the budget for everything with his pet projects. And so, yes, I mean, there's less money out there for scholarships, and CONACYT has much less resources. But I would say South Koreans, they don't have scholarships, and still they come in very large numbers to the US. So, I mean, let's make sure that in spite of this, Mexicans will have the will to come to the US and study here, because they will really affect in a very positive way their professional lives. So yes, but AMLO is doing that everywhere, not only in education. And it's only again about its projects. And I must say, yes, there was some corruption. I'm glad that, for example, now just having a conversation with the president of COLEF, he's telling us, well, now, for example, I don't even have a driver. I don't even have a car. That's fine. I mean, I guess he has a good salary to be able to pay for his own car and to drive himself to work. And I mean, AMLO it's AMLO, and on the other hand, a positive aspect of him is that he has been very disciplined, fiscally speaking. And I believe he made a mistake, because when you're in a crisis like during COVID-19, you have to increase governmental expenditure. But I cannot deny that he's very disciplined, and that's very rare in a leftist that has fiscal discipline. And because of that, I would say Mexico, I mean, this has very positive aspects. Andrea, what are the areas that the pandemic affected? Well, I believe drugs. Yes, because of the, I've been reading, Andrea, yesterday was a beautiful, but very harsh, very difficult to read article in the New York Times about this badly, I would say, crisis of mental health care in young kids all around the US. I just had a meeting with officials at UCSD, and we're seeing that we have about between close to 15% of students with mental health problems. There's a lot of drugs. There's a lot of people abusing drugs, and that affects Mexico, that affects the US, that fentanyl coming in from Mexico to the US. So I would say and migrants, the healthcare of migrants has been badly affected. Imagine a family coming in COVID times to Tijuana, or a Central American family sent back from the US to Mexico to wait there for 8 months. For 12 months, the asylum process. So I would say one of the areas which I have been badly affected during the pandemic is healthcare, and I believe we have very little changes between healthcare. I mean, because there's not enough resources in the US, less so in Mexico, to face this enormous need of healthcare, of mental care. It's again, this is something that we should think about it. This is something that, read that article yesterday at the New York Times, was very telling. This very well done research. They talked to a lot of kids that they've been having problems, and I can tell you, this is not only a problem of the US. I know that, for example, back in my alma mater at the time, there's been issues like that. Few problems here and there, and so this is affecting youth in the entire world, and is badly affecting youth in Mexico and the US. And I hope we could really put our act together and do something meaningful, because this is affecting in a very bad way the future of Mexico and the US, because it's affecting the promise of our future, which is young Mexicans and young Americans. Maria Fernanda, gender crisis. Yes, there's an awful gender crisis. Yes, the femicides have increased a lot in Mexico. I wonder why AMLO doesn't get it. And I believe that I've seen a lot of NGOs, I've seen a lot of US academics helping on this, but this is something that I would say it's, yeah, we do have a spike of femicides and a spike of gender violence, and we should do something meaningful to stop this. And we should do something meaningful to stop. It's, yeah, part of it, not all of it has to do with this culture of masculinity in Mexico, with the machismo, which is everywhere in the world, by the way. And you're right, Maria Fernanda, there's, I've seen some spikes of this during the pandemic. And finally, about digital, I would say yes. Now we're living a hybrid world. I'm putting together, for example, this very, what I believe is important conference in June 1st and 2nd. And I'm basically trying to figure out what is the best way to use a hybrid mode. And not easy. But I can tell you, for example, you're talking about American digital professionals living in Mexico. Well, and let me finish with this. I was very happy to see my dear friend Mark Fields. He's a business person from New Zealand, and he was, I believe, a very important guy. I met him being a very important guy in Thermo Fisher. Thermo Fisher is a very important business with its headquarters in Carlsbad, just north of San Diego. And Thermo Fisher is the single most important producer of scientific testing. They design tests for all scientists in the world. It's the #1 firm in the world. You know, under Mark, they had about 200 engineers in Tijuana at a point in Thermo Fisher. Mark quit his job in Thermo Fisher, and I haven't seen him because of the pandemic. I saw him last Thursday, and he was telling me, I have a new firm, and now I don't have 200, I have 250 Mexican engineers working for me in Tijuana. Not all of them are in Tijuana, 2/3 are in Tijuana, some are in Guadalajara, and some are in southern Mexico. This is amazing. He's telling me the engineers of Mexico are as well trained as the U.S. engineers, and I pay them good money, but cost me a fourth of what I would pay in the U.S. That is very telling of what we can of what we can do together if we put our act together. And I would like to finish with this. I mean, just imagine. I mean, this business is basically doing wonderfully because they've been able to hire 250 Mexican engineers, and they're doing wonderfully. They're making very good bucks, and they creating, I mean, a new workforce that has to do with the best of the U.S. and the best of Mexico. Let me stop here, Hazel, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you and to share with you some ideas.
Thank you, Rafa. This was very, very instructive. I'm sure that we all learn new things, and as usual, you are very good in eliciting new ideas and new ways of looking at this important bilateral relation. For us, it's an honor to start with you this series. I invite everyone to continue logging in on our next series. We will wait for you next Wednesday at the same time. And thank you very, very much, Rafa, again.
Thank you.